Thank you for that kind introduction and explaining the exercise of masochism that I'm currently engaged in. Um, I want to thank the Rockefeller Institute, not just for hosting this conference, but for being a sane and critical voice for a long time. I think one of the first calls I made after I had perused the state budget in July was to my old friend Dick Nathan. And I said, you guys have to educate me. And they've been terrific and more helpful than I can describe, and they will continue to be during the next 13 months of my incumbency. I have a lot I want to say today. I'm going to try to say it as succinctly as I can. I want to make it clear that these are my opinions. They do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the administration on every one of these subjects. I don't mean to suggest there's a conflict. I have enormous admiration for Governor Paterson for having been willing to take the tough position he has taken and will continue to take with respect to the deficits that the state of New York faces. I want to talk to you first, very briefly, describe the mess that we're in. We read these days about a $4 billion deficit for the balance of this fiscal year. The estimates about next year's deficit, assuming that is solved with recurring cuts or revenues, and it's not likely to be, as we know from the newspapers every day. Next year, the deficit, in my judgment, will be over $9 billion. And the following year, when the stimulus money ends, deficit could be somewhere between 18 and $20 billion. These are extraordinarily difficult numbers to fathom with in the context of the political world, and I don't use that word in a pejorative sense at all, in the world that we inhabit. One of the most fascinating things to me about these last months is, despite the inexorability of the numbers and the failure of anybody to contradict the accuracy, of course, to an extent, any predictive number depends on what happens with tax collections and mandatory expenditure growth, so there is some flexibility in all these projections. But as I will say further on, there is little cause to be optimistic on either front. What amazes me is the fact that behavior has not changed in Albany, or on behalf of all the constituencies that have a dramatic impact on Albany. The unions still believe that by picketing public events, that they can prevent the cuts that will be injurious to their members. The business community continues to finance the same people in Albany that they have always financed, continues to hire the same lobbyists to pursue, and I don't say this critically, their own individual commercial interests. And the banks continue to send people to Albany with all kinds of imaginative borrowing ideas, which are the things that got us into trouble in the first place. And they sit with in their civic capacity, expressing rectitude about the political process. A lot of my business friends, you know, I come out of the business world. A lot of my business friends say all the time, well, the unions own the legislature. Well, the truth of the matter is they don't own the legislature. They're just 10 times smarter than everybody else about how to deal with the legislature. And they have specific goals, and they have objectives which their leadership is paid to achieve. And you can't blame them for their motives. You can only question whether or not they, like everybody else, isn't understanding the consequences, the longer-term consequences to the very people and the very interests that they purport to serve. it's fascinating to me. I was chairman of the Citizens Budget Commission back in '93, and we issued, and Chuck Brescher recently sent me some of the reports that were issued under my name when I was chairman. And I wondered, why has nobody listened? It's not that they weren't thoughtful. There are other people. E.J. McMahon has been writing on this subject for some time. The Rockefeller Institute has been commenting on this for a long time. But nobody listened. Sending 1,000 hearing aids to Albany will not solve the problem. In my judgment, there will not be serious attention paid to addressing these problems until it gets worse, and it is rapidly getting there. You've all read about cash flow problems. I can't predict with accuracy at this point when that will happen, but unless there is a sensible budget adopted next year, it certainly will happen by June. We will literally not, at that point, not have the ability to fund the ordinary and programs and operations of the federal government, of the state government. When I attempted to try to understand how we got into this mess, there were two conclusions. We're all responsible. Perhaps not those of you who've been speaking out on this subject as vigorously as some of you have, but the community at large is responsible, in part because if you think about it, the people in the world that most of us inhabit spend a lot more time talking about Afghanistan and healthcare and what's happening to Mike Bloomberg and the city of New York than they do about what's happening in Albany. It's not a place that many people want to go to too often. And therefore, state governments, as Mr. Ward suggested, have always been relatively underreported because their primary function has always been to provide money to local governments to provide the services that in many cases were a function of federal mandates or federal seductions, depending how you put it. And the lack of attention, the lack of interest stems because there never seem to have been any consequences. We're all used to seeing at least once a year stories in the paper about budget impasses in Washington, in Albany. And somehow they always get solved. And we move to the next day and the next year and it's not in the paper. And what's happened? Well, I'll tell you what's happened. In the last 10 years, there have been between 20 and $24 billion of one-shots, of borrowings, asset sales, or similar non-recurring revenue items that balance the budgets. That in all but 2 of those years, the recurring revenues were insufficient to maintain the level of spending, which has gone up on a straight line basis throughout that entire period. The federal stimulus bill, which I'll come back to later, was intended to do a lot of things. But from the point of view of the state budget, it was 2 years of one-shots. Point of fact, the comptroller pointed out in a recent report that over $11 billion used to close the $17.9 billion 2009-2010 general fund gap was either non-recurring or temporary in nature. That's a staggering number. The budget division, which in many ways is the heart of state government, is grappling now with what kind of budget to present to the governor for his consideration for his budget message in January. There is not a single bit of happy news in all of the potential answers to that question. There are many of you in this room who could recite many more facts and numbers. I have a lot of them here, but I don't think that's the constructive way for me to use the few minutes I have with you. So let me address what I think is relevant and worth considering as you all deliberate this issue today and hopefully with the same level of intensity in the weeks ahead. Number one, there has always been historically the view that as a result of a recession, we had to solve the problem temporarily. That was the intellectual justification for using one-shots. And that we would, when the economy recovered, we'd be back where we were before. And indeed, that was the case, mostly in the last 20 years. We not only did we get back where we were, but we were beneficiaries of an extraordinary prosperity, growth in personal income, which is probably the most sensible measure of how New York is doing. And we never budgeted for rocky days. If we had a good year, we spent it all plus. And therefore, in every time we had a weaker year, we didn't have the revenue to support the money we needed, and then we filled the gaps with one-shots. Second of all, we looked constantly to the federal government to provide additional support for us. And today, there are many members of the legislature who say to me, well, we're going to get another stimulus bill. And that's what will help us out. So we don't have to worry about the 2010-11 budget year, let alone the 11-12 budget year, because the feds are going to bail us out again. Well, I think that's a dubious proposition. Again, I want to make it clear, this is my personal opinion. I think the political paradigm is shifting nationally. I think you see that in the growing opposition of the president's health care bill. And I think there is a very, very significant chance that the federal government will not face up to the consequences of the state deficits in a manner that is serious enough for us unless the problem gets more acute, which means where is this going to go if nothing happens? Because as you all know, New York is not unique. We're not in as bad shape as California, but there are very few states who aren't suffering with the same kind of deficits that we suffer from, and very few states that don't have a similar structural imbalance. One of the most interesting things I've learned in these last few months, when I asked the question of the economists in the National Governors Conference, what is the true structural imbalance of all the other state budgets? In other words, how many states used one-shots to fill budget holes? They answer me that they don't have good information on that because their constituency doesn't want to tell them the answer to that question. So we don't know, in fact, we know what New York's structural imbalance is and what it's been continuously in the last decade, but we do not know what those figures are nationally, and we don't know, and it's one of the challenges I think that the Rockefeller Institute could fulfill if, in fact, we're going to try to get governors and states to act more coherently and collegially as we face a common problem in the year ahead. I'm asked all the time, because people, the old timers certainly know that I was very involved in the city fiscal crisis in the mid-'70s. I did a lot of the negotiations with the federal government on the loan guarantees for New York City during that period. And I'm asked, what did you learn from that experience that could be helpful in solving today's problem? Well, what I learned was that the ability to file a bankruptcy petition is what gave us the leverage to get the concessions that were necessary from the financial institutions, the fiduciaries who didn't want to buy debt that was perhaps at various points uncertain, not as creditworthy as they would have liked to have been, and the unions to agree to layoffs and new pension tiers. That was all accomplished because the alternative for the unions and the financial institutions, had a bankruptcy petition been filed, would have been horrific. It would have resulted in the abrogation of all existing collective bargaining agreements, and it would probably have resulted, whether meritorious or not, with a lot of 10b-5 litigation against the financial institutions. And that's why everybody did what they had to do to avoid bankruptcy then. States can't file bankruptcy. They're not included in the bankruptcy code. And prevailing scholarship seems to suggest that the 11th Amendment to the Constitution would prohibit the Congress from including states amongst those who are entitled to take advantage of the bankruptcy code, the United States Bankruptcy Code. So that option isn't available. That isn't a trigger. So then the question is, how can we enforce some discipline on this, and how important is it to do so, and what are the consequences if we don't? Well, my own view is that if nothing changes, what will happen is you will see very significant cracks in the $3 trillion tax-exempt market in the United States. And when that happens, believe me, the Fed will have to pay attention. What they will do, I don't know. I think there are some smart people in various offices in Washington that are beginning to think about this. I'm talking to some of them. But I don't know what else happens in the outer world. I know what happens to states. And right now, not only because I have a fiduciary responsibility for New York State, but I've lived here all my life, long time. And I and my family have been beneficiaries of this place, and I care deeply about it. And I don't want to see what happened in California happen here. And in many ways, the best metaphor is they had great state university at the height of their hegemony, if you will, as a state. And it has been badly, badly hurt, and it is no longer the magnet that it was because of the economic distress. Well, our universities in the state of New York are in the long term the most important economic engine we have for our future. And they attract people, scholars, and students from all over the world. And if we begin to lose that, then there's less reason to be hopeful. New York was not only a leader in terms of social innovation, we certainly led the way as the Industrial Revolution created a whole different set of sociological dynamics in this society. We certainly led the way in coming up with methods of treating people more equitably, providing more benefits, cushioning the problems of the very poor and underprivileged. We were the leader in this state. New York, interestingly enough, New York, but for the immigration from all over the world, New York to New York City primarily, New York State would be losing population today because of our economy. When you go upstate, it's depressing. The 10 Most northern counties in New York State pay a property tax measured as a percentage of the true value of their homes that is greater than anywhere in the United States of America. So we have a lot to lose if we get dragged down into a mess of not being able to borrow, of having to cut not just what isn't critical, but to cut bone without having a sensible plan of recovery. Let me say that the reason that we cannot rely on the historical precedent of seeing an economy turn around is because, in my opinion, what we're going through is fundamentally different from every other recession that we have experienced in our lifetime. And that is, this was a prosperity that was created from borrowed money. And all that's happened fundamentally is that the debt has shifted from the federal government, from the private sector to the federal government. And that prosperity that we all enjoyed masked the fundamental decline of the American economy. During that period of time, we lost over 7 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. It didn't show up in the unemployment statistics because we had a lot of technical innovation and rapidly became a service economy. It's sort of revealing that entertainment is now the single biggest export from the United States of America to the rest of the world. True unemployment in the United States today is probably closer to 18% if you measure it by the people who are partially employed and those who don't file for unemployment. 30% of the homes in the United States have mortgages on them which have a face value that's greater than the actual value of their home. I don't believe we're on the verge of a turnaround. I would say that there is a significant amount of pressure building in Washington. You see it coming from a part of the political community to extend the stimulus, but the emphasis is on things that will create jobs. For the federal government to provide additional budget relief to the states, of course, we shouldn't turn it down, but if it's in another 1 or 2 years of one-shots, it's going to lead us all higher and higher on the mountain, which when we ultimately fall off of it, we will have an even bigger problem than we have today. So in my judgment, with all respect, this is the year in which we have to address the problem. We have to understand the political nature of the spending addiction that has afflicted the state. And again, it's not because they're bad people. And it is a function of the extraordinary wealth and growth and prosperity of this country and of the fact that people have been able to take advantage of the political system, not illegally and not immorally, to get money appropriated by state legislatures. I want to say something about the legislature. You know, it's very easy to sit and express enormous rectitude about the New York State legislature, and indeed other state legislatures as well. But I dare say there's hardly a person in this room who would be willing for $75,000 a year to spend 4 days a week in Albany, 6 months out of the year. And I think we have to ask ourselves that question before we overdo the rectitude. We have a unique situation now. We have a divided state Senate. both parties eager to win next fall's election because the next Senate will redraw the senatorial district lines, and that's uppermost in their minds. Unless there is some event between now and then, it is unlikely that that body will act responsibly with respect to the situation that the state faces. But why do I believe they ultimately will? And why do I not necessarily personally join in the characterization of them, though it's sometimes very tempting? And that is because I believe ultimately by this spring, where there may well not yet have been an agreed to budget, and we face the real possibility of significant layoffs and significant reductions in healthcare spending and in education spending, that will get people's attention. And despite the warnings and intellectual integrity of many of the people in this room, as I said in the beginning, the message hasn't gotten through and the behavior hasn't changed. So therefore, whatever those of us who have a big mouth can do to get people's attention is critically important. It is time to start going back and re-examining some fundamental questions, particularly what is the appropriate funding source as between the federal, state, and local governments for major governmental activity. What services should the state government be providing, in fact? Where is there duplication between the state and the local governments? Should we think about, if you recall, for example, Medicaid was in addition to Medicare, and it was viewed by the people who initiated the Medicaid program in Washington in 1965 as an adjunct to the poverty program. Well, it's a lot more than just an adjunct to the poverty program today. And I'm not saying it's bad or evil. I'm just saying if indeed this country wants to provide that kind of support for as many people and institutions that it currently supports, is it time to rethink whether that burden ought to be the burden of the federal government? Is that a bigger and sounder and fairer tax base to support the challenge of providing decent health care in America? Should the state taxpayers, certainly in New York, the question is also whether or not some of that burden, which we share with local governments, even though there's a cap on local government expenditures for Medicaid, but is that the right allocation? Is that the right tax base that we should be using to pay for these things? Education, same kind of questions. And I don't mean to suggest I have the answer, but K through 12 education, very important. How is the burden of that to be allocated? It's very interesting to me, particularly having spent most of my private life and my public life involved in building things, housing, subways, to think about the fact that state governments have always historically had the responsibilities of exercising their police powers and have been responsible for the public infrastructure in the United States, in their respective states. With the exception of the interstate highway system, which came about in the Eisenhower administration, infrastructure has remained the primary obligation of state governments. As state governments have been put in the position of having to fulfill, in some cases, as in New York, legal requirements to spend more on education, as a result of congressional mandates, as a result of federal seductions or public benefits, as you will, have been spending more and more money on that. They've been spending less and less on infrastructure. And if you really think about our state and our country, the underfunding of infrastructure is a very, very serious problem. This is the first year that New York State has no program for bridges and highways. We lost a bridge over Lake Champlain a few weeks ago. I recently read the engineering study on the Tappan Zee Bridge, and it scared the hell out of me. And we have to re-examine that question too. And are we using our borrowing power as it was originally intended, primarily to fund capital investments, or are we using it to plug budget holes in a lot of creative ways? I could go on at length about this. I guess I'd like to conclude by saying again how much I welcome the fact for all of us that there are a group of serious people at this institute and at SUNY who are thinking about these problems. And I hope that I can be a good Charlie McCarthy for you in the next year. I'm certainly not going to be shy about it. And I really believe that we are in, for all these reasons, all the historical reasons, all the political reasons, the dysfunctionality of the Senate, the numbers going south, continuing to go south. We're really in the middle of the perfect storm. And having said that, I don't have all the answers, but with the help of the Rockefeller Institute and a number of foundations that have contributed to the Rockefeller Institute to enable me to get some talented people to help me, I am going to try in these next months to put together, with your help, a 3 or 4 year financial plan for the state that ultimately closes the circle. And we are thinking very hard about what kind of discipline can be imposed, given all the constitutional limitations at the state level, and given the politics of Washington. Can we actually put into place a self-imposed discipline on the budgetary process over these next few years that would enable us to close the circle? And can we change at the same time the culture so people will understand that having real balance, that having our expenditures bear a straight line relationship with our revenues is a good thing, and not just to avoid more taxes, but to ensure a continuity, an ability to build, an ability to continue to provide the essential services that the state of New York must provide. I thank you very much for your time.
Minutes of the Lieutenant Governor's time before he needs to depart.
No, I'm gonna stay a while and learn.
Okay. Excellent. If anyone has any questions, I think we see one.
Sure.
There.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, you talked about the crack in the municipal bond market, the potential for that. And, you know, we've been seeing quite a number of kind of dire predictions about the credit quality of municipal bonds being published lately. And I just wanted to get a little bit more of your perspective on that. In terms of state and local
I certainly don't want it to happen. Understand that for many reasons. But at a certain point, you know, we have reached. Just look at New York State's debt. You know, we all grew up understanding that our Constitution was protecting us, because it said in order to pledge the credit of the state, you had to go to 2 legislatures and to the public. But what most people don't know is that out of our, I think it's $54 billion of debt, only $3 billion is the full faith and credit debt of the state of New York. We have devised the most extraordinary ways of borrowing money. It's not to be believed. Our personal income tax bonds in the state of New York are rated higher in the market today than the full faith and credit debt of the state of New York, because the personal income tax is put into a lockbox and hypothecated to the holder of the bond. It's very interesting to question. First of all, we do have a statutory bond cap, which we're at or about at. Anyway, of course, the legislature can keep raising that if they want. But we're there now, and it was not a stupid number to have capped the borrowing at. But just think about it. If we keep using our personal income tax revenues to borrow money that in part are going to help solve an expense budget gap, where are we going to get the cash to fund healthcare, police, et cetera, et cetera? So I don't know what will happen. I believe that ultimately it's going to get tougher and tougher to borrow money. Now, today, with the Fed keeping interest rates where they are, if you had to double the rate or triple the rate, it's still so low, it's not going to create an instant catastrophe. But I don't know whether we're in a long-term Japanese-style deflation, or whether I should believe the people who say that with a federal deficit growing at $1.5 trillion a year, we're going to end up having to inflate our way out of it. I don't know what the answer is, for sure. But I just suggest that it's going to be impossible to continue to borrow as we and other states have in the past for budget reasons. And at the risk of repeating myself, at the same time, presiding over the dramatically underfunding of our public infrastructure. Yes, sir.
Just ask if people have questions that you identify yourselves, and please press the little button on the speaker in front of you so that we can get your question on the recording.
Hi, Ed Cupoli, College of Nanoscale Science and Engineering. Thank you very much for your comments. The question, I'll slow down.
No, you can't.
The question, I can't. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The question is, when you talk federal, state, and local, the sources, I think that's fantastic, but also the uses and at the level. And when you look at the structural imbalance, I think you have to look at the state and local sector, not just the state.
Right.
And I don't think, I think you know this, I don't think it should matter whether you're looking at a Japanese or whatever. We're in a systemic, been in this long-term relative decline, other than from what's happened in the city over the last 30 to 50 years, some places 70 years in upstate. So there's a functional disconnect between the upstate economy and the downstate economy, but yet we don't deal with that in any substantive way in terms of the government acknowledging the relative cost structure. So we see the relative importance of the public sector being significantly different in upstate than it is in downstate. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but how do you deal with that in putting it in? And no matter what you come up with, I learned this from Joe Peckman in '86 when tax reform, as soon as the ink is dry, before the ink is dry, they keep changing it. There's very few ways, other than putting it into some bond covenant, if you had a long-term debt, that you can fundamentally lock it in. That's what I just wanted to
Well, you know, obviously, bond covenants can be extremely useful. I just reread over the weekend the Flushing case decision about the state's moratorium on the payment of interest on the city debt. And it was very interesting to me, I haven't read it for 15 years, to read the dissenting opinion, which argued that perhaps the state should have emergency power to do certain things under certain circumstances. Remember, the majority said that essentially that the state could not impose a moratorium on the city's payment of interest on the city's debt, because essentially the state had the taxing power to to meet those obligations, and therefore they couldn't avoid them. But as I said, this is a different paradigm, and it's a different set of circumstances. And the city's problem, that was a financial crisis. It also happened to occur during a recession, so there was a downturn. But fundamentally, it was an issue that nobody saw coming. I mean, I happened to be sitting with Governor Carey the day that Mr. Riston and Mr. Paterson and Mr. Butcher came in to tell him they would no longer underwrite the notes and bonds of the city of New York. We had no forewarning of that whatsoever. And all of a sudden, in an instant, the world changed. And fortunately, we were able to get out of it. It occurred at a time of the year when the city was relatively flush with cash. And we created a way of legislating a revenue stream to create new form of debt. That was MAC. Fortunately, we never had to decide the case. Had the city subsequently gone into bankruptcy, the holder of the city bonds would have said, hey, the allocation or legislating away the sales tax to the MAC bondholders was an unconscionable, voidable preference, even though there was no voidable preference provision in the municipal bankruptcy code at the time. But it would have been a very interesting decision for a court of equity to make, and fortunately, it never came about. But these are the kinds of issues that are going to come up in the course of this discussion that I hope is held at serious levels about how do we impose some kind of disciplinary mechanism, and how do we may not be able to cut $20 billion out of the budget in a single year. I don't think that's feasible. But the only justification for doing any borrowing is if we are going to close the circle and have that an enforceable obligation. Ed?
Nick, the problems of a profligate legislature were addressed in amendments to the state constitution propounded by Charles Evan Hughes and others in the 1920s. Giving the governor extraordinary powers, executive powers with respect to the budget. Those powers were upheld by the Court of Appeals recently, and also by the people when they rejected Proposition 1 in 2005. You commented on the problems with the legislature, but could you comment on the role of the governor in solving this crisis?
Yes. First of all, I know, I'm not telling any stories out of school, that we have exhaustively looked at that question in the course of these last 2 months, ever since the governor made it clear that we had a big deficit and asked the legislature back in, I think it was August originally, to address this year's deficit. There was a case, Ed, in 1976 when Hugh Carey tried to not make an expenditure that had been appropriated in the budget because it would have resulted in the budget being out of balance. And there was a famous case. It was the Oneida case, and it went to the Court of Appeals. And the Court of Appeals said the governor did not have the power to cut an expenditure in order to balance the budget, because his only constitutional obligation was to submit a balanced budget to the legislature. He did not have the constitutional power to force a balanced budget. Now, whether or not the governor can take action by himself as I said, is a very, very interesting question. And it comes up in two ways. First of all, we know that the governor has the power to lay off public employees. That is not disputed. Now, how many you want to lay off, what the consequences are to existing collective bargaining agreements, all of those are separate questions, but he does have the power to reduce the number of people on the state payroll. Whether he has the power or what he does if he doesn't have cash is a matter that has never been resolved by the courts. That would be clearly a matter of first impression. And that's why, forgive me for talking as a half-assed lawyer, but that's why some of the issues that I was referring to about the kind of covenants you can put in or the kind of enforcement mechanism you can put in become very interesting questions, because if you don't have the cash, it's hard to make an expenditure. And I don't know, I'm not smart enough to predict what will happen. I hope we don't have to reach that point, and that we're able to come up with some sensible solutions over these next few months so we don't actually reach that point.
Please join me in thanking